Honestly, I don't know why you even bother showing up here anymore. Did you really think you belonged?
The resilience of the human spirit is often tested not in the grand moments, but in the quiet endurance of the everyday. Take notes.
We knew this wouldn't be easy, but we'll get through it together. You just have to stay strong.
The cafeteria buzzed with the usual chatter, but Jade felt the shift. The weight of the stairs on her back was no longer subtle. It was sharp like the air before a storm. She glanced over to the corner where Becky and Sarah, two of the most popular girls at her high school, snickered into their phones. Their eyes flicked to her, and they exchanged a smirk, one Jade had come to know all too well. "Look at this," Becky said, loud enough for Jade to hear, her voice a mix of amusement and venom. "She's got the audacity to wear that in public." Jade's hand gripped her tray tighter, her knuckles white. She wanted to turn, to speak, to say anything. But she stayed silent. There was no point. No one would step in. Not here. Not ever. Then came the whisper. It was soft at first, a mere slip of sound, but it spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of the cafeteria. "Nigger." The word wasn't a whisper. It was a clear, taunting declaration. Becky's voice dripped with the intent to humiliate, the sharpness in her tone cutting through the noise. Jade froze. She didn't react. Not physically. But in her mind the world shook. She could feel every second stretching into eternity. Her breath hitched, and she forced herself not to look back. A teacher stood nearby, but her eyes were elsewhere. No one else even flinched. Jade's heart thudded against her ribs. This was her life now. She had no choice but to live it, but could she? And then, just as the silence started to suffocate her, Becky's laughter echoed like a punch. "What are you going to do about it?" she sneered, her words sweet as poison. Jade's fingers curled into fists, her body trembling. The world felt impossibly small, the walls closing in. But one thing was clear. Jade wouldn't let this moment define her. She'd have the last word. And she would make sure they never forgot her name. The cafeteria was loud, the usual hum of chatter filling the air like a dense fog. Jade picked at her food, her eyes fixed on the small corner of the room where the popular crowd sat. Becky and Sarah, with their perfectly styled hair and perfectly manicured nails, were the center of attention as they always were. They sat in their usual spot, surrounded by a group of laughing, talking, and nodding students. Jade knew she should have just looked away, but she couldn't help it. Her eyes met Becky's for a brief second, and that was enough to see the smirk. That smirk, the one that made Jade's stomach churn. She didn't know why Becky hated her so much. She'd never done anything to her. They were from different worlds, but high school was cruel that way. Becky turned to Sarah, her voice low but cutting, just loud enough for Jade to hear. "Look at this," she said, holding up her phone and turning the screen toward Sarah. "Can you believe she's wearing that? In public?" Jade's heart clenched. It was a beige sweater, nothing special, but to Becky, it was an invitation. An invitation to make Jade feel like the outsider she'd always been. Totally. Who even wears that stuff anymore? Sarah laughed, her voice high-pitched and brittle. "It's so like last year. She's so behind." Jade's face burned with shame. Her mind raced. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, or at least she imagined it. There were so many students here, but in this moment, it felt like it was just Becky, Sarah, and her. The laughter grew louder, more invasive. She couldn't escape it. But Jade didn't say a word. Not yet. She couldn't afford to make a scene. She had learned long ago that it was easier to disappear into the background. To blend in. No one cared about the black girl sitting quietly by herself. At least, that's what she told herself. Just then, as if the world wasn't already small enough, Jade heard it. It was barely a whisper, but it carried across the cafeteria, slicing through the noise like a knife. Nigger! The word stung, a slap across her skin, a reminder of everything she hated about this place. Her chest tightened, the room around her beginning to spin. She wanted to scream, to shout at them, but instead she did nothing. Her tray felt heavier than ever as she shifted in her seat, keeping her head down. The laughter continued, but now it felt more hollow, more venomous. She didn't even look up. She couldn't. Not with that word hanging in the air like smoke. Becky's voice broke through her fog, this time louder, more venomous. "What are you gonna do about it?" she asked, her voice dripping with mockery. "Cry to the teacher. No one cares." Jade felt the sting of the words all over again. But this time something else lingered in her chest. A flicker of rage, too small to be called an idea, but big enough to make her hands tremble. She felt the familiar feeling of isolation, the creeping chill that came with knowing she was different, marked by her skin, marked by the way they saw her. They were everywhere, and she was here, just trying to survive another day. It would pass. She'd get through it. She always did. But not this time. Not this time. Jade rose from her seat, her back straight as she gathered her tray, walking slowly toward the trash. Her feet were light, but inside, her mind was full of fire. The shame, the anger, and the injustice churned, mixing with a familiar sense of helplessness. She couldn't do anything about this. She had never been able to. But as she reached the trash can, something shifted. A question echoed in her mind, louder than anything she had ever heard before. What if I didn't just let this go? She paused. Her fingers, still gripping her tray, tightened around the plastic edges, the metal clinking in her grip. For a fleeting second she thought about turning back, about confronting them, about fighting back. But the moment passed quickly, like a gust of wind. She dumped her tray into the trash, her shoulders tight with tension. The cafeteria had gone quiet, and Jade didn't look back. She couldn't. Outside, the sun shone bright, a sharp contrast to the dark clouds in her mind. For a moment, Jade thought maybe this was it. The world would keep spinning, the abuse would continue, and she'd fade into the background once again. But deep down, she knew something had shifted. She had just felt it. This time, the silence wouldn't be enough. The next few days felt like an endless loop. Jade could feel the eyes following her wherever she went, in the hallways, at her locker, in the classrooms. She could sense the whispering just out of earshot, the smirks behind her back. It wasn't the loud, obvious cruelty of the cafeteria. It was the subtle, insidious kind. The kind that made you question yourself, your worth, your very presence. The kind that made you feel small without even having to try. She didn't know what was worse, the direct harassment or the way everyone acted like it was just normal. As if the cruelty was as much a part of the high school experience as the cafeteria pizza or the bleachers at Friday night football games. Jade had always been an outsider, but now it felt different. The world around her felt like it was closing in. There was a layer of tension in the air that she couldn't shake off. She was the target now, and it seemed everyone knew it. At lunch, she sat alone in the back of the cafeteria, far from the center where Becky and Sarah still held court. The usual group of students who had once shared a smile with her now ignored her, unwilling to even make eye contact. Jade had expected this. She had anticipated it, but it still hurt. The world she thought she belonged to was no longer hers to claim. She pulled her lunch tray closer, pretending not to notice the whispers coming from the table next to hers. But she couldn't help overhearing one girl say, "Did you hear what happened with Jade?" She didn't even say anything when they called her that. Jade's stomach twisted, and she turned her gaze downward, willing the tears not to come. It wasn't the first time she had been talked about like this. But now, in this moment, it felt like the whole world was watching her, waiting for her to react. Yeah, she's probably used to it. I mean, it's not like it's the first time, right? A guy added, his voice low, but still carrying across the table. Jade's heart pounded in her chest. She hated it. The casual dismissal. The way they spoke about her pain like it was just something to be expected. Something inevitable. She wasn't just invisible to them. She was expected to be invisible. But no matter how hard she tried to push it away, the words stuck. Every passing day was another reminder of how deeply she was marked. Not just by her race, but by the way the world saw her because of it. That night, Jade sat at her desk, trying to focus on her homework, but her mind was elsewhere. She stared at the equations on the page, their symbols swimming in front of her eyes. Her mother's voice echoed in the back of her mind. You can't let them define you, Jade. You have to be stronger than them. Jade squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push away the sting in her chest. She didn't want to hear her mother's words. She didn't want to be strong anymore. She wanted to be normal. She wanted to walk down the hall without feeling the weight of every eye on her, without hearing the murmurs behind her back. But that wasn't going to happen. Not as long as Becky and Sarah were around. Not as long as this school was the way it was. The truth of it hit Jade like a punch to the gut. No one was going to change anything for her. She had to do it herself. But she didn't know how. She wasn't sure she even wanted to fight anymore. Fighting meant drawing attention to herself, and attention was the last thing she wanted. Still, the thought of doing nothing gnawed at her. She wasn't just going to let Becky and Sarah win. Let them be the ones to define who she was. As Jade closed her notebook, the heaviness in her chest grew. The weight of isolation was something she had carried for years, but it felt different now. It was darker, heavier. Maybe she wasn't alone, though. Maybe Alex, the new guy who had kept to himself, would understand. They'd shared a few awkward smiles in passing, but he was quieter than most, and Jade couldn't help but wonder if he saw what she saw. If he felt what she felt. The idea of talking to someone, of sharing what she was going through, was both comforting and terrifying. But she couldn't keep running from it. She couldn't stay in the shadows forever. Jade knew one thing for sure. This fight was going to be harder than she ever imagined. But she wasn't about to let it defeat her. Not this time. The next day at school, Jade's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out between classes, hoping for something to distract her from the weight of everything, but when she unlocked it, her stomach dropped. A new message popped up in the group chat she had been added to a while back. Seniors 2024. It wasn't that she had ever been particularly close with anyone in the group, but she had assumed it was just another one of those high school formalities. Her name was tagged in a message, along with a handful of others. Is this real? One of the messages read. Did you see her picture on Facebook? Jade scrolled down, finding a link to a Facebook photo she hadn't posted herself. It was an old one, a family photo from years ago, her with her younger brother and her mother at a barbecue. They were all smiling, and it wasn't a glamorous picture. Nothing special. But as she stared at it now, her heart sank. The caption below it was the last thing she ever wanted to see. Anyone else find it weird how a black girl dresses so well? Almost like she's trying to fit in with us. The words stung more than she could have imagined. It wasn't just the photo being shared without her permission. It was the assumption behind it. The implication that she didn't belong here. That she was somehow out of place, even in her own skin. It was subtle. A thinly veiled insult disguised as curiosity. But Jade knew exactly what it meant. She was a problem. Someone who had no right to even try to blend in. She was still the outsider. No matter what she wore or how hard she tried, there was always something about her that screamed different. Her fingers trembled as she read through the comments below. Some were mocking her clothes. Others were focused on her hair. Bet she spends hours on that fro just to look cute, one person commented. Jade's chest tightened. The insidiousness of it all. It wasn't the overt racism that burned the most. It was the quiet, constant reminders that she was never seen as just a person. She was always going to be different. Always going to be other. She put the phone away quickly and rushed to her next class. But the feeling of being watched never left. It followed her down the hall, through the door of her next classroom. As she sat down in her seat, she could already feel the silent judgment, the hushed whispers from behind her. She didn't even have to look to know that the conversation had shifted. The same thing was happening in every corner of the school, a slow, methodical campaign to turn everyone against her. When the bell rang and Jade made her way to her locker, she was approached by a familiar voice. "Hey Jade," Alex said. He had been quiet since the first time they had exchanged a few words a few days ago. He stood awkwardly, his backpack slung over his shoulder, looking uncertain but determined. Jade stopped, forcing a smile. "Hey, I saw what's going on," Alex continued, looking around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. "I'm sorry. I know it's tough." Jade's heart skipped a beat. She was used to dealing with everything on her own. No one ever reached out. Everyone just looked the other way. "You don't have to say anything," she murmured. "It's fine." Alex hesitated. "It's not fine though, is it?" Jade looked up at him, and for the first time in days, she felt like she wasn't so alone. "No, it's not." The brief moment of connection felt fleeting, like a breath of fresh air in a room full of smoke. "Have you thought about doing something about it?" Alex asked. "I mean standing up for yourself. Telling someone." Jade shook her head, her thoughts swirling. "What's the point? No one cares. If I say anything, they'll just say I'm overreacting. And that's the last thing I need. I don't want to be the angry black girl." Alex frowned, his eyes softening. "That's exactly why it's a problem though, isn't it? Because you're not allowed to feel angry or hurt without being labeled." Jade looked away, the weight of his words sinking in. It was true. She had been quiet for so long, swallowing every slight, every comment, every glance, hoping it would all just go away. But it didn't. Never did. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she said quietly. "I don't know how to fight back." "You don't have to do it alone," Alex said, offering a small, reassuring smile. "We can do something together." Jay didn't respond right away. She stared at him for a moment, unsure of what to say, unsure of whether she could really trust him. But something in his eyes made her believe he wasn't just saying words. He meant it. He had seen it. And maybe, just maybe, they could fight back together. The bell rang again, signaling the end of their brief exchange. As Alex walked off, Jade stood there, a small flicker of hope igniting in her chest. For the first time in days, she felt like she wasn't standing alone. But the feeling was fragile, and Jade knew there was a lot more ahead of her. Still, for now, she held onto that brief spark of hope. It was all she had. The days that followed felt like they were dragging on, each one heavier than the last. Jade could feel the weight of every glance, every whispered comment, every little insult that floated through the halls of her school. She couldn't escape it, no matter how hard she tried. The rumors, the jokes at her expense, the way people pretended they didn't notice. It was relentless. She could barely focus on her classes anymore. She was slipping into autopilot. There were days when she'd stare at the board, hearing her teacher's words but not really understanding them, her mind too occupied with the noise in her head. It was exhausting. And all of it had started with that moment in the cafeteria. With Becky's laugh and that word. But it wasn't just the students anymore. It was the teachers too. The casual microaggressions that Jade had learned to ignore for years suddenly felt magnified. It was Wednesday afternoon when the tipping point came. Jade had just finished math class and was rushing to her next period when she saw him. Mr. Whitaker. The one teacher she had never really gotten along with. He had always seemed cold, distant, and a little too quick to dismiss her answers. But today, something about him rubbed her the wrong way. She had just passed him in the hallway when he muttered something under his breath. His voice was low but sharp, and she couldn't quite catch all of it. "It's like they think they can just take over everything." Jade stopped in her tracks, the words hanging in the air like smoke. He wasn't even looking at her, but she could hear the disdain in his tone. She turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest, and saw him smirk at the group of students next to him. He was talking about her. It was clear as day. It wasn't about the schoolwork or anything else. He was talking about her. About the fact that she was here. Her mouth went dry. Excuse me. He didn't seem to notice she was standing there, staring at him, her breath caught in her throat. He was still chatting with the students, as if he hadn't just made that comment about her. Her jaw clenched, and she took a step forward. Mr. Whittaker. He turned toward her, his expression blank. Jade. What's the matter? What did you just say? Jade asked, her voice tight. The words seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds, the anger she had been holding in bubbling to the surface. He blinked, clearly caught off guard by her boldness. I didn't mean anything by it. Just talking to my students about. He trailed off, his voice faltering as he realized he couldn't hide behind the excuse anymore. Talking about what? Jade's fists clenched at her sides. Talking about me. About my presence here. Her voice was growing louder, and she didn't care. She had spent years swallowing this, pretending it didn't hurt. But now, every word, every comment, every glance felt like it was eating her alive from the inside. Mr. Whittaker took a step back, his posture defensive now. Jade, you're overreacting. I wasn't talking about you. Her vision blurred. That's exactly the problem, she spat. You always think I'm overreacting. Like it's all in my head, right? Well, maybe it's not. The hallway had gone quiet. Some students had gathered around, but no one said a word. Jade could feel their eyes on her, the mix of curiosity, discomfort, and even judgment. But the anger burned brighter than her embarrassment. She wasn't going to let him or anyone else belittle her anymore. I see what's happening here, Mr. Whittaker, Jade said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and exhaustion. You don't even have to say it out loud. I hear the way you look at me. The way you see me. The words stung, but she pressed on. Maybe I'm not the problem here. Maybe the problem is people like you, who don't even know they're part of the system that keeps people like me down. She turned on her heel, walking away before he could say anything else. Her heart was racing, but she didn't look back. She couldn't. Jade barely made it to her next class before her emotions started to catch up with her. The rawness of everything she had been holding in, the years of discrimination, the constant microaggressions, the feeling of being less than, all of it spilled over. She sat in her seat, head down, trying to focus on her breathing. And then, just as quickly, she heard someone approach. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. Alex. You okay? He asked softly, sitting down beside her. Jade shook her head, feeling the sting of tears but fighting them back. No, I'm not okay. For a moment there was silence, the kind that felt heavy, but also strangely comforting. Then Alex spoke again, his voice quiet but resolute. You don't have to be okay, Jade. Not right now. But you can't keep letting them get away with it. You've been silent for too long. Jade met his gaze. His eyes were steady, filled with a fire she recognized, the same fire that had started to burn in her chest. She didn't want to fight. She didn't want to make a scene. But she also didn't want to live in a world where silence meant survival. Alex was right. She couldn't let it go any longer. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that this was normal. Her voice, hoarse and raw, barely above a whisper, broke through the tension. I'm done pretending. The next few days felt like a shift in the air. Something had changed, though Jade wasn't entirely sure what it was. She had confronted Mr. Whittaker, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a small, simmering relief. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't even justice. But it was a start. She had spoken her truth, and for once, the silence wasn't suffocating her. The whispers continued, of course. Jade wasn't naive enough to think it would end with one confrontation. The students still looked at her the same way, some with pity, others with that familiar judgmental gaze. But something was different now, she could feel it. The walls felt a little less closed in. It was early Friday morning when she decided to take a small but significant step. Sitting at the back of the library during lunch, Jade pulled out her notebook, the one she used for all of her thoughts, all her private reflections. She hadn't written much in it lately. Most days it was too painful to even put pen to paper. But today, something was calling her to write. Her pen moved across the page as she wrote down her experiences. How it felt to walk through the halls and see the way people stared, the way the teachers ignored her struggles, the way her silence had been the only way to survive. The words spilled out raw and unfiltered. There was no filter anymore. No pretending. She knew what this meant. Writing this down, putting it out in the world, even if no one ever saw it, was a step toward reclaiming herself. For so long, she had buried her truth to protect herself. Now she was ready to share it in whatever way she could. After a few hours, Jade closed her notebook. She had written more than she had expected to. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Later that day, as she sat in English class, a sudden idea came to her. The school newspaper. It was the perfect platform to voice her thoughts, her anger, her experience. Jade had never considered writing for the paper before. It was one of those things that felt like it wasn't for people like her, like they wouldn't care about her perspective. But after everything that had happened, she realized the truth. Someone had to care. Someone had to listen. After class, Jade went straight to the school newspaper office. She had never been there before, and when she stepped inside, the smell of ink and paper hit her, a sharp contrast to the stale air of the rest of the school. There were posters on the walls, the student staff scrambling around, working on layouts and proofreading. It felt like a foreign world to Jade, a world that had never been kind to her, but one she was determined to join. The editor, a tall girl with short hair and thick glasses, looked up from her desk as Jade hesitated in the doorway. "Can I help you?" the editor asked, her tone polite but curious. Jade took a deep breath, pushing past the lump in her throat. "I want to write something. About racism. About what it's like here. At this school." The editor raised an eyebrow but didn't dismiss her. "What exactly are you hoping to write?" Jade shifted her weight, suddenly unsure if this was a good idea. Maybe she was rushing into this. Maybe it would just make things worse. But then she thought of the words in her notebook, the way they had spilled out, the way her anger had been building. She couldn't let that go. She couldn't let it eat her alive. "I want to write about the way students treat each other here. How it's not just the bullies, it's the teachers, the system. How no one speaks out, even when they know what's happening. I want to share my story." The editor stared at her for a moment, assessing, and for a second, Jade thought she might be rejected. But then the editor nodded slowly. "All right," she said, her voice serious now. "We'll need something written up by Monday. You get me something, and I'll make sure it gets in the next issue." Jade's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected that kind of response. She had expected to be laughed out of the room. But this was different. This was an opportunity to make her voice heard, to reach more people than she could have ever imagined. "Thank you," Jade whispered, her voice full of emotion. "I won't let you down." As Jade walked out of the office, her heart raced. She was scared. Scared of the backlash, scared of what might come next. But for the first time, she felt a spark of something more than fear. It was power. The power of speaking up, the power of writing her truth. That night, she sat at her desk, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. The words poured out, flowing like they had been trapped for years. Every sentence felt like a small victory. She wasn't just writing an article. She was reclaiming her voice. By the time she finished, it was late. Her eyes were tired, but she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she had taken the first real step toward making things right. She wasn't just going to let the silence win. She was going to make sure her story was heard. Jade could feel the quiet stirrings of something bigger in the air as the weekend drew to a close. It wasn't just her. She could sense it in the way people were looking at her, in the way they were starting to talk about her article. The school's student body was full of whispers, but this time they weren't all mockery. Some of the whispers were different, more thoughtful. Some were even hopeful. She hadn't expected the article to have such an immediate impact. She had expected the usual dismissal, the kind of response that said her pain wasn't valid, that her experiences were just one of those things people should get over. But it hadn't been like that. Not this time. On Monday morning, Jade walked into school with a sense of unease in her chest, but also a flicker of defiance. She had been bracing for the storm. It would come, she knew. But when she stepped into the cafeteria, she was greeted by something she didn't expect. A small group of students, a mix of people she didn't recognize and a few faces she did, were standing near the doors. They had printed out copies of the school newspaper, and several of them were talking quietly, glancing over at Jade as she entered. At first, she thought they were mocking her. But when one of the students made eye contact and gave her a nod of acknowledgement, a strange sense of warmth rushed through her. "Hey," Alex said as he walked up to her, smiling, his face bright and sincere. "I read your article. It's amazing. You've got people talking." Jade blinked, still a little surprised by the change in atmosphere. "Really?" "Yeah. People are saying it's about time someone said it. People who've been quiet about this stuff for a long time. I've heard a lot of support," Alex continued. "There are even a couple of teachers talking about it. It's sparking a conversation." Her heart thudded against her ribs, a mix of pride and nervousness sweeping over her. "I didn't think anyone would care." "You'd be surprised," Alex said. "There are more people who see it than you think. They just didn't have the courage to speak up." Jade smiled faintly. "I guess I've always been afraid to speak up. I didn't want to make things worse, but it feels better now." Before Alex could respond, one of the students who had been standing near the door approached them, a shy girl with glasses and an oversized hoodie. "Hey," she said, her voice quiet but determined. "I just wanted to say I'm with you. I saw your article and, well, you're not alone in this." Jade blinked, feeling a strange lump in her throat. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "You don't know how much that means to me." The girl nodded, looking nervous but steady. "I've been trying to speak out too, but it's hard, you know? It's like everyone's afraid to do anything because it's always so. Hush hush. But you made me feel like maybe I don't have to be silent anymore." Jade felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just the article anymore. It was something bigger than her now. People were listening. People were starting to care, and that scared her. But it also filled her with a strange, unshakable resolve. Maybe they didn't all understand what she'd gone through, but they were beginning to understand that something had to change. As the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, Jade felt a mix of anxiety and determination. The small spark of support she'd felt today was just the beginning, but it was enough to give her the courage to keep going. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been too afraid to speak their truth. And maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something bigger. She still didn't know what would come next. She didn't know if things would get better or worse. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't backing down. Not anymore. Later that afternoon, as she sat down to finish some homework in the library, Jade was interrupted by a knock on the doorframe. She looked up to see Mrs. Alvarez, one of the few teachers who had always treated her with respect. "Jade, may I speak with you for a moment?" Mrs. Alvarez asked kindly. Jade stood, heart racing, unsure what to expect. Was this going to be about the article? Was she in trouble? "I just wanted to let you know that I read your piece in the paper," Mrs. Alvarez said as she stepped into the library, her voice soft but firm. "And I want to thank you for your courage. It's about time someone said something, and I think you've started an important conversation. I'll be supporting you however I can." Jade blinked, her mouth going dry. You're not upset." "Upset?" Mrs. Alvarez smiled. "No, I'm proud of you. It's hard to speak out, especially when the world wants to ignore the truth. But sometimes, truth is the only thing that can change things." Jade felt the weight of Mrs. Alvarez's words settle in her chest. It was a small thing, one teacher, one conversation, but it felt like the universe had shifted just a little bit. "Thank you," Jade whispered, fighting back the tears that threatened to well up. For the first time in weeks, Jade felt like maybe, just maybe, there was hope. Real hope. Hope that wasn't just a fleeting feeling but something that could actually change things. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Jade could feel the momentum building. the energy in the air palpable as more students began to join the conversation. It was like a dam had broken, and for the first time it felt like people were willing to acknowledge what had always been there but too often ignored. But as quickly as things began to shift, the pushback came. It always did. Started subtly. One morning, Jade walked into homeroom to find a group of students sitting in the back of the room, laughing and talking as if nothing had changed. But as soon as she entered, the laughter seemed to die down, the whispers returning in full force. There was no way to ignore it. She could feel their eyes on her, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Becky and Sarah were back at it too. The look in Becky's eyes as she passed by Jade in the hallway was one of pure malice. "Look at you," she muttered, loud enough for everyone around her to hear. "Trying to be some kind of hero. It's pathetic." Jade kept her head down, her heart racing. It was hard not to react. Every instinct in her told her to lash out, to say something sharp, to fight back. But she remembered the advice Alex had given her. You don't have to fight every battle with words. Your actions will speak louder. But Jade could feel the tension mounting. There was only so much silence she could endure before it would break her. That afternoon, the first official protest was planned. It wasn't going to be a massive event, just a small group of students gathering in the courtyard to stand against the toxic atmosphere of the school. Jade wasn't sure what to expect. She had no illusions about what would happen. She knew the school administration wasn't going to like it. But she had to try. She arrived at the designated area with a mix of excitement and fear. A handful of students were already there, holding signs, their faces filled with quiet resolve. It was heartening to see them, people who had been silent for so long, now willing to speak up. Alex was there, of course, along with a shy girl from the cafeteria, and several other students she didn't know. But it wasn't long before the backlash started. The administration sent out a wave of security guards to monitor the protest, their presence intimidating, stifling the energy. Teachers were told to watch closely, making sure the students didn't get too out of hand. Becky and Sarah appeared soon after, accompanied by a few of their friends, their faces twisted in mockery. Becky's voice cut through the air, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look at this," she sneered. "A bunch of kids pretending they're revolutionaries. You think this is going to change anything? You're just embarrassing yourselves." Jade stood tall, despite the gnawing fear in her stomach. She knew this wasn't going to be easy, but something about the way Becky spoke, like she had already won, made Jade more determined than ever. "You don't get it, Becky," Jade said, her voice steady but cutting. "You think silence will make it go away, but it doesn't. You're the one who's embarrassed. Not me." Becky scoffed, clearly taken aback. "What are you going to do, Jade? This protest isn't going to change anything. People like you are always going to be here, just trying to make everyone feel guilty." A cold wave of anger rushed through Jade. She had heard this before, the same tired rhetoric that kept people like her in their place. The idea that her pain was something to be ignored, something that didn't matter. She took a step forward, her voice rising. "You want to keep ignoring it? Fine. But you won't get away with it anymore. We won't let you." Her words echoed through the courtyard, cutting through the tension. A few students nodded in agreement, their faces filled with quiet pride. But the administration wasn't having it. The security guards stepped forward, attempting to break up the protest. "This is over," one of them said firmly. "You need to go back to class." Jade's heart sank. She had known this would happen, but it still stung. The school was never going to listen. It wasn't just about one protest. It was about a system that had been built on silence, on making sure people like her never had a voice. But then, something unexpected happened. A few teachers who had been standing on the sidelines stepped forward, joining the protest. It was subtle at first, but it made a huge difference. Mrs. Alvarez, the teacher who had supported her before, was among them. "We're not going anywhere," Mrs. Alvarez said, her voice firm and unwavering. "This is a fight worth having." For the first time, Jade didn't feel so alone. The teachers, who had always seemed so distant, were now standing beside her, standing beside all of them. It wasn't the whole school, but it was a start. The protest continued for a while longer, though it wasn't as loud or dramatic as Jade had hoped. Eventually, the security guards and administration forced them to disperse, but the message was clear. Jade and her fellow students had made their point. As she walked away from the protest, Jade felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it had begun. And this time it wasn't just her fighting. There were others now. And together, they were going to make sure their voices were heard. Jade barely had time to catch her breath before the storm hit. The protest, though small, had set off a ripple effect throughout the school. Word spread quickly, not just among the students but to the faculty, to the community. The ripple reached beyond the courtyard that afternoon. It reached every corner of the school, and soon it reached the local news. At first, Jade didn't know what to expect. She had been prepared for resistance, for backlash. But nothing could have prepared her for the immediate, sweeping response from the administration. Within hours of the protest's end, emails were sent out to students and staff, an official statement condemning the demonstration as disruptive and divisive. Jade's name was nowhere to be found in the announcement, but everyone knew who had started it. The article, the protest, it was all linked to her. She tried to push it from her mind, tried to focus on the glimmer of support she had felt just days before, but the weight of what came next was too heavy to ignore. The principal, Mr. Daniels, called her into his office first thing Monday morning. Her heart sank as soon as she saw his office door. His desk was stacked high with papers, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive coffee and stale tension. "Jade," he began, his voice level but his eyes cold. "I need to speak with you about the protest last week." She braced herself, knowing exactly where this conversation was headed. "I know it wasn't approved," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I felt like it was something that needed to happen. People were listening." Mr. Daniels folded his hands on the desk, his expression unchanging. "Listen, Jade. I get that you're upset, but this kind of disruption won't be tolerated. The protest disrupted classes, and it made the school environment unsafe for other students." Unsafe. The word hung in the air, thick with irony. Jade couldn't help but feel the sting of his words. He was talking about the protest, not about the system of abuse and racism that had allowed her to be silenced for so long. The protest, the one thing she had done to demand change, was the real disruption. "I wasn't trying to make anyone uncomfortable, sir," she said, her voice quieter now. "I just wanted to speak up about the way people like me are treated here. I understand your frustration, but there are other ways to address these issues. Disrupting the school day like that isn't the solution," Mr. Daniels replied, his tone dismissive. "You'll be receiving a one-day suspension for your role in organizing the protest." The words hit Jade like a punch to the gut. Suspension. A punishment for speaking out, for demanding her right to exist with dignity in a place that had constantly told her she didn't belong. It wasn't just unfair, it was a message. A message that told her, once again, that the system would always protect itself first. And that she, no matter what, would always be the one who had to pay the price. Jade wanted to argue, to fight back. She wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, that she had done nothing wrong. But there was a lump in her throat that made it hard to speak, a wave of anger and helplessness that threatened to swallow her whole. "I understand," she said finally, her voice tight. "Thank you for your time." As she left Mr. Daniels' office, she felt small. The weight of the suspension pressed down on her chest, and for a moment, she wondered if it had all been for nothing. What had she really accomplished? The protest hadn't changed anything. She had spoken up, but all it had earned her was more silence, more punishment. But just as she made her way to the front office to gather her suspension paperwork, she was stopped by a familiar voice. "Jade." It was Alex, standing by the side of the hallway, his expression serious. When he saw her, he walked over quickly, his face filled with concern. "They suspended you?" he asked, his voice low. Jade nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah. I guess I should have expected it." Alex shook his head, his eyes narrowing. This isn't right. They're punishing you for doing what's right. That's not okay. I know, Jade said, her voice tinged with frustration. But what can I do? It's not like I have a choice. Alex stepped closer to her, his voice growing more urgent. You don't have to fight alone, Jade. This isn't over. We can't let them get away with this. The whole school needs to know what's going on. Jade looked at him, feeling the exhaustion in her bones. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we keep pushing, Alex said. We need to show them that we won't be silenced. We need to take this to the next level. Jade's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure she was ready for more. The emotional toll had been overwhelming, and with every step she took, it felt like the walls were closing in. But Alex's words lit a fire inside her that she couldn't ignore. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been silent, everyone who had been too afraid to speak up. You're right, Jade said, her voice steady now. I can't stop. I won't. And for the first time since the protest, she felt like the fight wasn't a lonely one anymore. There were people beside her, people who cared, people who were willing to stand up too. Together they could make their voices heard. The days following Jade's suspension felt like a blur. Her parents, though disappointed, stood by her. Her mother, ever the rock, reassured her that she was doing the right thing. You're making a difference, Jade, her mother would say over and over, even as the weight of everything began to crush her from all sides. The backlash from the protest had been swift and severe. It wasn't just the suspension. It was the way people had begun to treat her. The whispers, the rumors. Students and teachers alike had taken sides. Some people offered support, but many others stood silent. The silence, as always, felt louder than anything else. But Jade didn't let it defeat her. She couldn't. Every day felt like a step forward in a long, hard journey. But there was no going back now. The legal battle was about to begin, and Jade found herself at the center of a storm far bigger than she ever imagined. One evening, as Jade sat at the kitchen table, her mind spinning with everything that had happened, her father came in with a thick envelope. He placed it in front of her and sat down next to her, his face unreadable. What's this? Jade asked, running her fingers over the envelope. It's a letter from the lawyers, her father replied. They've decided to take your case. It's time to make some noise. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had never imagined it would go this far, but after the protest, after the suspension, it seemed inevitable. The injustice of it all couldn't be ignored anymore. There was a chance, a real chance, that the school district would be forced to answer for what it had done. Jade opened the envelope, her eyes scanning the letter. The firm was taking on her case pro bono, which was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, she was grateful for the opportunity. But on the other hand, it meant the fight was about to get much harder. This wasn't just about one girl standing up for herself anymore. This was going to be about shining a light on everything that was wrong, everything that had been wrong for years. We'll have to start gathering evidence, her father said, his voice calm. Testimonies, documents, your article, the protest footage, everything. Jade looked down at the letter again, her hands trembling. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected any of it. But now that it was here, now that the fight was official, there was no turning back. The weeks that followed were filled with legal meetings, research, and interviews. Jade's life became a whirlwind of paperwork and phone calls. She spent hours in meetings with the lawyers, learning about the legal process and what the lawsuit would entail. Her parents were there for every step, guiding her, offering words of encouragement, but she could see the toll it was taking on them as well. Jade tried to stay focused, but as the days passed, it became harder to ignore the mounting pressure. The legal system was slow, methodical, and Jade had to be patient. But she wasn't always patient. She was angry. Angry that it had come to this. Angry that she had to fight for what should have been hers by right. The support from her classmates, though small at first, began to grow. They had heard her story, read her article, and seen the protest footage. Some still whispered behind her back, but more and more students were speaking out, standing with her. It wasn't just the protest anymore. It was the conversation that had begun. The conversation that had been long overdue. One afternoon, during a break in the legal proceedings, Jade received a text from Alex. It was simple, but it hit her like a ton of bricks. "We're all behind you. You're not alone in this." She smiled to herself, feeling something in her chest stir. The words meant more than he could ever know. In that moment, Jade realized she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced. And that gave her the strength to keep going. As the case against the school district moved forward, the media began to take notice. What had started as a small local issue was becoming something much larger. News outlets picked up on the story, reporting on Jade's fight for justice and the racial discrimination she had faced. At first, the coverage was minimal, but soon it began to snowball. Interviews, news segments, and even debates in local forums started popping up. More people were talking about it. More people were asking the hard questions. Jade found herself thrust into the spotlight, her every move scrutinized. She wasn't sure how to feel about the attention. It was both overwhelming and validating. People were listening. Her voice, the one she had once kept silent for so long, was now being heard. But with the media attention came even more pressure. The school district fought back hard, hiring high-powered lawyers to discredit her. They argued that her protest had disrupted the learning environment, that her actions had harmed the school's reputation, and that the suspension was justified. They twisted her words, tried to frame her as an agitator. It was a strategy to discredit her, to make her seem like the problem rather than the system that had allowed the abuse to happen. Jade found herself face to face with the very system she had tried so hard to expose. The weight of the legal battle, the constant media scrutiny, the pressure from her peers, it all felt like too much at times. There were days when she wanted to quit, when she wished she could just go back to the way things were before the protests, before all of this. But then, she thought about the people who were supporting her, the students who had stood with her, the teachers who had spoken out, and most of all, the ones who were still silent but listening. She couldn't stop now. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Months of grueling legal battles and mounting pressure finally reached their breaking point. Jade had been to court more times than she cared to count, sitting in sterile rooms filled with lawyers, journalists, and school administrators, each encounter pushing her further into the whirlwind of her fight for justice. There were days when she wanted to collapse, when the weight of everything seemed too much to bear. But she kept going, for herself, for those who couldn't speak up, and for the truth that had been buried for so long. The case had escalated, gaining momentum with every passing week. The media had picked up on the growing tension, and soon Jade's name was being broadcast across the state. What had started as a local issue was now a landmark case in the ongoing fight for racial justice in schools. People were paying attention, and the pressure on the school district had grown unbearable. Finally, the day of the ruling arrived. Jade sat with her parents in a small, crowded courtroom, her stomach a tight knot of nerves. Her lawyers sat beside her, their faces a mixture of hope and concern. It was an emotionally charged moment, with the weight of months of preparation and argument hanging in the air. The judge, a stern woman in her 50s, sat at the bench, her eyes scanning the papers in front of her. Jade's heart hammered in her chest as the judge cleared her throat and prepared to deliver the verdict. After a long pause, the judge finally spoke. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Jade Williams, and orders the school district to take immediate steps to address the systemic racism and discrimination present at the school. The suspension issued against Ms. Williams will be expunged from her record, and the district will be required to implement mandatory anti-racism training for all faculty and staff within the next 6 months. The words hit Jade like a wave crashing against the shore. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She glanced at her parents, their faces a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming pride. Her mother squeezed her hand tightly, a silent gesture of support, while her father sat still, unable to contain his emotions. He had always been her rock, and now she could see that he was just as shaken as she was. "We did it," Jade whispered to herself, her voice cracking with emotion. But the victory wasn't just hers. It was for every student who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. It was for every voice that had been silenced by fear. And it was for every teacher who had stood by her, who had risked their own comfort to fight for what was right. The victory was bittersweet, though. Jade knew that while this was a step forward, the work was far from over. She couldn't pretend that everything was perfect now, that the fight was done. It would take time for the school to change, and even longer for the culture to shift. But this was a start, a real one. As the courtroom emptied, Jade stepped outside with her family, the late afternoon sun warm on her face. The world seemed a little brighter, a little more hopeful. It was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. "So, what's next?" her father asked, his voice full of pride. Jade looked up at him, her eyes full of determination. "Next, we make sure they don't forget." Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to see a message from Alex. "You did it. Proud of you. Proud of us." Jade smiled, feeling the weight of it all finally lift off her shoulders. "Yeah," she whispered to herself, feeling the tears begin to well up in her eyes. "We did it." The next few weeks were filled with small victories. The school began to implement the training the judge had ordered, and the district publicly acknowledged the issue. Becky and Sarah were disciplined for their role in the harassment and bullying that had taken place, though they had since graduated. Some students continued to support Jade, while others avoided her, too uncomfortable to confront the truth. But Jade didn't mind the distance. She had won a victory that was bigger than popularity, bigger than fitting in. She had fought for something that mattered, something that would outlast the fleeting opinions of high school students. The emotional toll had been heavy. Jade carried scars from the fight, not just in the form of bruises, but in the quiet moments of reflection when the memories of the hurt and rejection crept in. But she was resilient. She had proven that time and time again. Jade's story didn't end with the lawsuit. It didn't end with the legal victory. It was just the beginning. She knew the road ahead would be long, but now she had something she hadn't had before: hope. And she wasn't going to waste it. She looked at the horizon, the future stretching before her, wide open, and finally, for the first time in her life, Jade felt like she had a place in it.